So first, I just want to welcome you, Leah, to the assignment. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, just for people to understand, Indivisible has been around for a few years now, going back to the first Trump administration. Can you talk about, just so we have a sense, a tiny bit of that history? Because I understand that in your mind, you had just experienced the kind of Tea Party protests. You were a legislative staffer, and all of a sudden, you have this right wing populist movement that spawned not just protests then, but like senators and lawmakers and energy that politically we all live with now. What was it that you saw then that struck you?
Well, so my husband, who's also my co-executive director at Indivisible, and I, we were congressional staffers during the early Obama years, which meant that we saw both the triumphs, like passing the Affordable Care Act, and the real frustrations of a legislative agenda that was bogged down by ferocious local opposition led by this movement of the Tea Party, and we got a lot of up close and personal interactions with those folks as congressional staffers, and then we moved on and we went on to other parts of our careers. I worked in human trafficking policy, Ezra in poverty policy. But in 2016, when Donald Trump was elected and when we were suddenly watching everything that we had ever worked on on the verge of being swept away by this incoming administration, as we were watching this rise of white Christian nationalism and authoritarianism, and as we were frankly seeing a Democratic Party that did not seem prepared to deal with any of it, we kind of like went back to those lessons. We were seeing this massive surge of people looking for answers for what to do. We were getting asked by previously non-political friends, like, how do I organize? Can I do this? Can I do that? And we decided that we were going to take the lessons that we had learned from our own interactions with the Tea Party, from their model. We were going to take out the racism and the bigotry and the violence, and we were going to turn it into a how-to guide for people all over the country who are trying to figure out, what is my power? How do I organize? How do I make my voice heard to stop this incoming Trump menace? And so we turned
I'm
it
going to
into.
just hold on one second. I'm going to put aside how you characterize them for one second and talk about that strategy, because I think there's some irony here that a generation born out of the community organizer president, Obama, didn't take their lessons from him. What is it that was specific about what the Tea Party, air quotes, had done? Because it also, I remember covering it, it started chaotically. Despite everyone's sort of determination that, oh, the Koch brothers had astroturfed this and this was somehow a movement that was just like completely planned, in a lot of ways it wasn't. It was a coalition of fractious, smaller groups that came together or maybe were backed by donors. But it was messy at first and it came together into something. What was it that you experienced that you wanted to replicate?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about that. It was messy and it was organic. It was really apparent to anybody who was working on the ground and actually interacting with them that while there was absolutely like a layer of money and structural support that got layered in by the Koch brothers, the initial sentiment, which was heavily racial and xenophobic in nature. But the other thing that I would say there is, I think that the lessons are actually kind of like are capable of being adapted from either side. The Tea Party took much of their work, took much of their own organizing theory from Saul Alinsky, right? So we see the kind of like original left-wing community organizing getting repurposed by the Tea Party in their own theory of how to organize locally. And then we're kind of pulling from what we had seen about how they operated. And so I
But
think it's.
the reason why I'm asking that is because over the last decade or two, there were Occupy Wall Street. There
Oh, yeah.
was the Black Lives Matter mass movement. Never mind the prior few years of backlashes that were city to policing. There have been all kinds of progressive street protest movements in the last few years, and arguably none have been as successful as the Tea Party. Even Indivisible outraised the Tea Party, in fundraising for a time. But I don't have an Occupy Wall Street senator, so to speak. There isn't a Ted Cruz and a Mike Lee or any of those folks um, that that have permeated the politics. And so I'm trying to understand, what do you think, based on what you learned from them, what do you think a movement should look like? And what do you consider success?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to go too far down the lane of like what I consider successful about them specifically, but what I would say that
No,
they
I mean
did
success for a movement.
yeah.
What is a measure of I have no idea. Is success turnout one weekend? Is success a winning midterm? Is success thousands of chapters that are active and recruiting? I'm not from this world, so what do you consider a good day and a good thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say the long term success really is rooted in thriving local grassroots infrastructure. It is rooted in people all over the country who are taking leadership, creating communities, absorbing folks who are poking their heads up and saying, what do I do in this moment? And then moving them into effective and strategic action and into local relationships that can sustain so that you have
Do you
the
mind saying
capacity.
that for my mom to understand? How would you say that
Yeah.
to someone you're actually trying to recruit?
I would say so. What I tell people when I'm trying to recruit is that Indivisible is a movement for people who understand that politics is too important to be left up to the politicians, and understand that when we come together and when we understand our own power, then we actually have far more than we think. And so, what we
And you
talk
tell
about.
them, if we do this, and if you do this with me,
Mhm.
this is what we can achieve. What is the this?
Well, what we can achieve is going to change based on the moment, right? We were born out of a moment of reaction. And so the initial conversation that we had with our folks, the initial guide we had that went viral and led to the formation of thousands of indivisible groups, was really about how you organize sustainable local infrastructure and then deploy a set of tactics that are designed to use leverage in relation to your elected officials, right?
That part I understand as your core argument, actually. I remember opening up the newspaper and seeing a No Kings ad for the protest. What's interesting to me is that story you've just told is not different from the story you might have told during the first Trump administration. In the second Trump administration, they're just taking everything further. So there's a lot to unpack there. Number one, second Trump administration. Despite your organizing, despite your fundraising, despite the spread of sort of an anti Trump nonprofit infrastructure, he came to power again with the support of swing voters. And number two, the things you are now asking people to turn out for, um, they've heard and have been hearing for a long time. So, what do you feel that you learned from the first time around?
Yeah. So I would take a step back because I think that sometimes when we have this conversation about kind of what did Resistance 1.0 produce, we kind of ignore the intervening 4 years, right?
So
Because
you've heard this before. You've had this argument before with
this is
people
not
inside the
unfamiliar.
community or people outside the community who usually ask this question.
I would say both, right? Because people, we're all in a reflection mode at some point or another. But I think most commonly I hear it as some version of like, well, how could the resistance, like, what was successful if Donald Trump is back in office, right? And here's what I would say. We understood our job as the folks who were building this grassroots infrastructure, who were organizing. What we wanted to do was build the kind of popular opposition that would get Donald Trump out of office and then achieve the kind of systemic reforms and accountability that would prevent him from getting back into power. And our movement was really aligned on the fact that we collectively were not, our end goal was not getting him out. It was actually getting voting rights. It was getting structural democracy reform. It was seeing accountability for the perpetrators of January 6th. We were not the only deciders on what got on the agenda and how it moved in the Biden years. And quite frankly, as somebody who was
But as a protest, go back to
yeah,
that list because some those things didn't come to pass
right.
in a lot of way, right? The voting rights thing you brought up, but like
Yeah.
even January 6th, as all of them have now been pardoned. So what the
Yeah.
things you identified specifically.
Yeah.
It sounds like you
Well,
identified specifically the things that didn't really pan out if they were your even personal goals for the organization.
Well, I would say they were collective movement goals. I think that there was actually a very clear thread that we were pulling out from across people who were organizing throughout this time, that they got activated by Donald Trump, but they recognized very quickly that Donald Trump was a symptom, not a cause, right? That he was a manifestation of broader political forces around polarization, around kind of the longer term struggle for democracy in this country. And so there was broad support for kind of like, we actually can't just get him out. We have to like fix the system in ways that makes democracy deliver for other people. Now, again, I would ask this question of people who made decisions about what priorities they had, whether they were willing to move forward on legislation like voting rights and structural democracy
So when
reform.
you
And
mean
what
people,
we,
you mean legislators.
yeah, I mean, so
Okay.
here's what I would say. Like, our job, we understood our job as getting Donald Trump out, right? Someone else's job was governing in a way that kept him from coming back. And
Now, the
I
difference
would
with the
say,
Tea Party is they felt like their job was to take over and then to make those priorities the priority.
yeah, and I
That
think
it wouldn't be left to a mythical someone else, and certainly not the Republican Party as its establishment. And again, I'm not picking on you. I'm asking you these questions specifically because you worked in a legislative office, right? Your Venn diagram is a circle of like understanding what lawmakers do, what it's like to run, but then also coming out of that world and trying to build coalitions and do all this work you describe. You're sort of uniquely positioned to understand the difference between the two and how to transition from one to the other.
Yeah, and I think one of the lessons that a lot of folks across the ecosystem take as we reflect on the course of the last 8 years is that we need the kind of leaders who understand the importance of structural reform and accountability for arresting backsliding in a democracy, right?
But where do those leaders come from?
Well, I think they're emerging right now. I think you're seeing people within the Democratic Party who are speaking out with a really clear lens on what is at stake, on the fact that we are in a crisis. And you're seeing
Meaning
some
Democrats
people
who already are in office, though, right? Like not an influx of new people running. Like it's accountability from the people already in.
I think both and, right? These are conversations that will happen between people who are already in office, and there are conversations that will be litigated in elections to come, right? In primaries, obviously the Tea Party was a very aggressive employer of primary elections. That wasn't one of the central focuses of a lot of folks across the grassroots early on. There were some people who, our movement got behind very early and was enthusiastic about backing, but it wasn't a primary emphasis during the first Trump term. I'm hearing from a lot of folks across the ecosystem right now who are very actively, they're more skeptical about just saying, we gotta just get in line and collectively push forward. They want to hear what people are actually going to do to fight back and treat this situation like it is an emergency. Not
I want to
politics
decode
as
that.
usual.
So, because you said people, and I don't always
Yeah.
know who people is. So it sounds like what you were saying is you are hearing from more activists and volunteers that they don't want to quote unquote get in line. And I'm decoding get in line means follow existing Democrats, establishment people in office.
Yeah.
Is that what get in line means?
Yeah, I would say there's a skepticism of leadership and a skepticism of institutions and a skepticism of the Democratic Party right now that is broadly felt, that is coming out in ways that we might be able to predict right now, ways that we might not be able to predict right now, but that really manifests as people wanting to see more and wanting to see folks treat this like the crisis that it actually is. And yeah, that will show up in who people align up behind. We've seen, some members of the Democratic Party really show up in ways that have earned them a ton of loyalty and enthusiasm from the base and the grassroots. We've seen others decline to do so. And so, I'm not going to predict everywhere that will go, but like what I do think is very true is we're seeing across the movement that people are gravitating towards the elected officials and the candidates who are willing to treat this like the constitutional crisis, like the emergency for our democracy that it is, and that they're really skeptical of people who are treating this like business as usual. And I think that we can expect that to have a significant direction on the future of the Democratic Party in the immediate future.
I know that there are a lot of progressive activists who look at the choices that the Biden administration made when they came to office and were frustrated, right? Like that they somehow didn't carry forward some of the energy that had been in the streets. What's one thing you regret or you wish you did differently during that time?
So I think that there were decisions that we made as an advocacy community to prioritize the legislative agenda, right? We needed to go full force campaigning for a stimulus and relief package. We needed to go full force fighting for voting rights and structural democracy reform, full force for the Build Back Better package. And there was kind of a perception, I think, for many folks that, the kind of political capital required to go fast on prosecutions and to really prioritize them in a way that the Merrick Garland Justice Department didn't, to prioritize a meaningful effort at a second impeachment, et cetera, that those were distractions from the ability to move key policy priorities. And I think
So
that
people said, let the law enforcement guys deal with January 6th. We don't need to spend time protesting them.
yeah, I mean, I think that collectively, and again, when I say this, I mean me, I mean everybody who made decisions about what we were talking to activists about, and I mean democratic leadership. I think collectively we needed to recognize that part of how you pull a democracy out of this descent into authoritarianism is you actually create some meaningful consequences for people who have attempted a violent coup. And the fact that we didn't do that created the conditions for Donald Trump to slink off, kind of lick his wounds for a little while, and for his movement to regroup and to reassert itself. And so, fundamentally, I think it's a lesson that we all collectively have to take about the balance of what is necessary to ultimately pull out of a democratic backslide.
So what do you wish you did differently?
I wish I had said that at the time. I think we were really. I wish that we had collectively, as a broader movement, been willing to say we cannot simply turn a page. We actually have to address what just happened. People. These are the things that have happened, and we can't simply keep moving.
The reason why I'm asking all of these questions is because for a time when I was covering the South, the story that I sort of came to understand about the civil rights movement, the Black civil rights movement of the late 60s and the moment when that became more multiracial, is there were moments where protests could turn violent. There were moments when non-violent protest was met with violence, and that was in part the goal, right? Before we had viral moments, we had people say to the Children's March in Birmingham, you may have to put yourself in harm's way so people understand what, quote unquote, we are dealing with here with segregationists in the South. You're going to be harmed doing that. I don't know if people are prepared to do all that today. And so what does that mean for inviting people out into the streets to protest, like this weekend, when all week they've been watching on the news a government that is prepared to respond violently?
Well, it's a question we take enormously seriously. And also, it's a question where we understand the answer cannot be to simply go along in advance, right? When you have a situation.
But do you hear what I'm saying? Like, have you had people say to you, like, I don't know if I want to do all that?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
are you guys, is this what we're doing? Is this what how organized is this
Yeah.
movement? Is it prepared to do that kind of thing? Is it really nonviolent, or is it just hoping we all turn out?
Well, let me talk a little bit about how we've prepared, and then I'll talk about the reaction that I'm getting. So, we've got about 1,900 events around the country. We have been doing intensive safety and de-escalation training, both for hosts and making trainings available for attendees, including, traditional know your rights, but also more intensive around, how do you handle various kinds of scenarios and escalations in the event of law enforcement, in the event of counter protests, in the event of agitators. We take those responsibilities to prepare people to have these events enormously seriously. And so we're in regular contact and support with the organizers of these events all over the country. Now, what I would say in terms of how do you talk to people about risk in this moment is we're not going to tell people that there's no risk. We're not going to tell people there's no reason to be concerned. What we are going to say is that we can prepare, we can collectively embrace nonviolence and nonviolent principles, and we are ultimately going to be stronger and more powerful together. Simply declining to show up in a moment when an authoritarian is pushing the boundaries, is trying to get away with things that are illegal, is deploying military to chill protest and to quell dissent inside American borders. We have to show up in a moment like that. It's not going to get safer if there is not broad popular opposition and pushback in this moment. Now, the other thing about it is it's not just us, right? Like, this is a massive coalition. We're working very closely with folks across the civil rights community, organized labor, veterans groups, faith leaders. We want to build the biggest possible spaces. We're talking about these as joyful community celebrations where we're lifting up each other collectively and leaning into our own collective power. The point of this is not anti-Trump. It is about the power of the people, and it is about the
But it's
power
also
that
called No Kings.
it is.
So,
That's
right,
true.
it's not called Power to the People, so
Well, you
which
can call
probably
it
was taken, but
yeah.
like let's be honest, right? Like the
Yeah.
reason why I'm asking this is I'm wondering if it is easier or more difficult to do this kind of organizing in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter anti-racism mass protests that came in 2020 and maybe 2021, where that drew people who were not from the activist class, and that is what made them remarkable, mainstream, draw attention.
Well, first, just to go back to the No Kings point, one of the things that we've intentionally tried to do in the protests that we've organized and that we've worked with coalition partners to do is build frames that allow us collectively to show up, regardless of what issue is bringing us out, regardless of what personal motivation is bringing us out, build the biggest possible tent frames that allow us to pull in people who, maybe we're not going to agree on everything right now, but we can collectively agree that we don't want kings in this country. So we're trying to create frames that give us, kind of the biggest possible tent of people who can agree in order to get folks out, get them into motion, and absorb them into local sustainable organizing relationships. So just to
So
say,
to translate, you're trying to make a story everyone can sign on to without feeling like there's a part of nuance that they're like, oh, I don't really agree with that part. It's like, none of us want a king. That's a good story. It's a short sentence story.
and it's a story that we can each add to, right? Like I can
Yeah,
talk
but
about
that's
why
what you
I'm
mean by
showing up.
frame. I just want to make
Mhm.
sure I'm
Yeah,
translating this,
exactly.
for the audience.
Exactly. Yes, that's right.
So the second part of the thing you wanted to address is whether it's easier or more difficult to organize this kind of protest and draw, like I said, non-activist class folks out into the streets when their takeaway from the last couple of years might have been, well, what was the point of that?
Well, what I can tell you is, we've had this protest announced. It's been about 6 weeks. We were planning for it to be quite substantial. In the days since Donald Trump threatened and deployed the National Guard in California, we have seen RSVPs skyrocket. We have seen more events popping up. Um, People understand intuitively that this is a moment where they've got to make their voices heard collectively. They understand that this is not necessarily one single thing or one intervention that's going to fix it all, but it is part of creating a culture of popular defiance of Donald Trump that starts to push back against the ways in which our society has been kind of folding and collapsing under a would-be authoritarian.
The reason why I'm asking is because I sometimes, again, feel that disconnect between national organizing groups. You're doing No King's Day, great. People are out in the street over immigration raids.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, should
as
that
many
be
of our
the
folks are.
national focus, right? When a day comes together, and I don't always know how to reconcile the two. For the people who are throwing rocks out in the street, like they don't just feel unheard by this government. They don't just feel um, frustrated with ICE. It sometimes they're also frustrated because they don't feel heard by the people who should and could be supporting them.
Well, and I would say, like our folks have been, and when I say our folks, what I'm talking about is indivisible groups around the country, right? They are people who are actively working with local immigrant rights organizations. They have been themselves delivering Know Your Rights trainings or attending them. They have been, they are often folks who are themselves showing up at these protests as well, and are heavily involved in protesting on behalf of immigrants and immigrant rights. And I think that there's a longer story here, right, around kind of like the abandonment of immigration as an issue by a lot of kind of the smart political pundit class who have collectively tried to like recede from any telling of the story of what is happening right now.
And by this, do you mean Democrats? Sorry, I hate to
Yeah.
keep decoding. Are you talking
Sorry.
about Democrats?
Yes. I would say
Okay.
yes. I'd say a certain political strain within the Democratic Party, within Democratic consultants, right? Who, immediately after the 2024 election were kind of like, this is we lost, it's toxic, we shouldn't touch it again, as opposed to we actually have to be firm and clear in defense of our values, in defense of basic standards and humanity and decency.
I think what I'm trying to figure out is, are to me, it seems like you're in a new landscape. You're not in 2016. you're in a landscape where more people have actually turned out to protest in a lot of ways in some cities. They've had that experience maybe in the last 7, 8 years in some major cities. So why would they do it again? What is it that you're telling them now? Because it feel like maybe they don't feel like one of the reasons why they may be feeling dispirited is not just because of the opposition, so to speak, not just because of how the government is reacting, but because they actually feel like there was no significant change on the issues they cared about from those past protests.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And
we
if
have
you're on the right, you don't feel that way, right? Like
right.
you now
We
have
don't
an
want to burn down.
anti-vaccine movement that's like ahead of the Health and Human Services. You've had corporations being like diversity. I don't know her. Like we do know what a winning protest movement looks like.
Yeah. So here's how I would talk about it. I'm going to do two versions of this, right? Okay. So I think we have a short-term crisis, which is that there is a would-be authoritarian who's rapidly running through every page of the authoritarian playbook, and we have to halt the democratic collapse that we are seeing. And then I think we have a longer-term crisis, which is that we have to have a democracy that actually delivers for people in a way that they are invested in it because they experience it as something that is making their life better. That was not a test that this democracy passed in 2024, right? We know that we lost folks not because they were like all in on Donald Trump. He has his core base, but we lost some set of folks who were simply so frustrated with the status quo, who had experienced the last 4 years as not what they needed, not what they're not making their own personal lives better, and and who did not experience appeals to institutions or appeals to kind of abstract ideas about protecting democracy as relevant or as more persuasive than simply it's time for a change. And so we have a long-term challenge, which is about how do you actually break through that level of cynicism. And that's got to be involved like actually having the systems and the structures for democracy that can deliver for people meaningfully in a way that they feel in their lives. But in this acute crisis, what I tell people about why we're showing up is I situate it in the context of the broader collapse that we're experiencing, right? So the poli-sci people, they talk about autocratic breakthrough, which is like the period of time when somebody takes power, they sprint to consolidate as much power as possible. They try to crush alternate sources of power and they try to chill dissent. And we have been in that period of autocratic breakthrough basically since Trump took office. There's this aura of inevitability that a successful authoritarian creates. They create the sense that they will consolidate power and thus whoever you are, whether you're a federal worker, whether you're a big law partner, whether you're at an institution of higher education, the rational move is to go along with them, to do what they're telling you to do, to bow down and just secure your own safety in this new order. And that's what a successful authoritarian does. They create that aura of inevitability. We have to, in order to ultimately halt the kind of collapse of institutions that is hurting us so much, we actually have to do things that disrupt that perception of inevitability, right? That introduce into people's minds some sense of doubt that this is actually going to be Trump consolidating power, that maybe he's actually going to, wildly overreach, get pushed back, be discredited, leave office in disgrace, and, you're still going to be here, and who are you going to be in that moment too? So we have to actually get folks to behave as if they need to live in both of those worlds, because I want to invite anybody who is willing to be courageous in this moment. And I want to create the conditions in which anybody who is making decisions based on who they think is going to win thinks there's a real chance that the pro-democracy coalition is going to win.
I think the problem is I'm preoccupied with the tipping point between people like you and the work you do and getting out what we call the average person, who, as a news reporter, when you're out covering it and you're saying, hey, have you done a protest before? They go, and I've never been out, but it really felt like this was the time. The thing that I don't know is, based on watching so many protests play out over the last few years, I don't know what that tipping point is. Maybe there's an academic out there who knows what that tipping point is, where it moves from being something that looks like it's preoccupying a smaller community to a broad-based one. When did Occupy Wall Street become Occupy Wall Street, right? Like, when did to this day, even as a Black American, don't totally know why it was George Floyd's death, out of all the deaths that I had been hearing about, that made the average middle-class white person turn out. And I guess I'm overly preoccupied with that. I'm asking you 100 questions that try to get at, hey, do you know how to create a tipping point? We
Yeah.
know this week we've witnessed a spark,
Yeah.
the kind of riotous, complete with flames and flags spark that happens with spontaneous rebellion and anger at government action. That check box out of LA. We know people like you are organizing big official protests with lists and groups and meetings and Facebook groups and whatever. I don't know that it's that middle part. It's that
Yeah.
average person. What makes them think? And have you studied that? Have you wanted to figure that out, that alchemy for yourself?
I guess I'd say a couple things. The first is I think everybody in any version of this space has to have some humility about the fact that it is extremely difficult to predict, except in retrospect, what is going to be the moment when, the dam breaks, right? And I think we should be real about the fact that part of what we do is having preparation and having infrastructure so that when we see moments of organic energy, there are people who are ready and able to create more able to support and also able to ensure that organic energy doesn't dissipate, right? That people who show out for the first time, they find a way to move into ongoing action, right? So I think that's one piece of it. But the other thing that I would note is even the biggest protests, right, are still going to be a relatively limited portion of the population. Our biggest protests are, at 5% of the population, right? And so there's a question about what gets those people out. And then there's a question about what actually speaks to people who frankly don't even care that much about politics and don't pay a ton of attention and are often the folks who we're actually trying to reach when we are collectively, there's what brings more people out. And then there's what is the message to people who currently don't even, would never even consider joining a protest, but need to be pulled into an understanding of what is happening in this country.
When there are outbreaks of violence, do you consider that a step back? Do you consider that a problem for your own strategy and your approach? There are lots of ways that progressives view and think about moments of violent clashing with police. I don't know where you are on that spectrum, but what are you thinking about given LA going into the next few days of your own organizing?
Yeah, we're affirmatively committed to principles of nonviolence and strategic nonviolence, right? We understand that it's going to be really, really important for us collectively to show up as a nonviolent movement, and we are working very closely with our folks to make sure that people are really trained and careful around security, around safety, around de-escalation, clear on nonviolent principles. And we think that's a really important part of creating the conditions for getting a lot of folks out who, we want people to bring their kids. We want people to bring their dogs. We want to create in these moments a sense of community and support and care for each other. And foster that via a real clear commitment to bringing out as many people as possible.
Is that atmosphere you're trying to create more or less likely given the last 5 days?
Well, what I can tell you from the people that I'm hearing from is that we've got event organizers and we've got people showing up all over the country who understand that precisely because Donald Trump is attempting to crack down on peaceful dissent, on peaceful protest, precisely because of that, it is more important that we are collectively out in the streets.
What are your hopes for the Monday after this weekend? What would you like to see, and do you see this moment as a turning point?
Yeah. I would like us to get a surprising number of people in a surprising number of places out. And I think it's worth noting that we've seen obviously very, very large protests in blue states and cities, but we're also seeing really significant turnout in places that you or I would think of as quite red and quite conservative. I would like for this to be understood as a moment in which Donald Trump, attempted to send tanks to Washington, D.C., attempted to deploy troops to California, and was collectively and roundly rejected by Americans for his fascist theatrics, for his attempts to harm our communities. I would like that to be, I would like us to collectively harness the kind of political opposition that forces them to back off what they are doing to our immigrant communities and our immigrant neighbors, to what they are doing in order, or the ways in which they are illegally attacking and sending law enforcement into California. We want them to recognize that they have to back down from what they are doing. And then we want to continue to build the conditions for courage across our society so that we mount that broader pushback against authoritarianism.
Leah Greenberg, thank you so much for talking with me. I appreciate your time.
Great to be here.